It's great to be here. Growing up, Australia was a make-believe place on the other side of the globe. I'm looking forward to going home and bearing witness that there's an actual people here, an actual country, and that it's incredibly warm. I can say this, that the entire time I've been here, and that's going to be the case till I leave, the environments that I have been in, people will say, have you seen this, have you seen that? I haven't, because I'm here really for the specific purpose of communicating in this particular vein in multiple venues. So what I have, however, been able to be in the company of are Australians. It's not, of course, the whole spectrum of Australians, but I have, for a particular subsection of folks, been in your company in a kind of sustained and intimate way. And to that extent, I believe I've been privileged to have a vista into your country that other folks who might have seen all of the typical landmarks might have missed. So although I will have missed a lot of things, I will not have missed what might be the central thing. And I can say that it has been very, very rewarding and gratifying. So thank you very much for the warmness that I have received. I really do appreciate it. Now, I had one particular objective that was just a must-do, and that was to see a kangaroo. That has not happened yet. I did, however, have a kangaroo meat stick from the Fremantle Marketplace, which somehow didn't seem to be in the spirit of the quest, so I really apologize about that. In any case, it's great to be here. Now, let's get into some stuff that I find profoundly meaningful and interesting, and I suspect that you do as well, or I wouldn't be here. First, I'd like to say there is no me in dementia without you. There is no me in anything without you. There's no me, in fact, in me without you. The idea that there is some little tiny self, some self-subsisting, autonomous thing named me that has its own kind of independence, irrespective from a human environment, that may be one of the more colossal myths of the Western world. We are profoundly social beings. We're not social beings on the weekend. We're not social beings when we get a chance. We're not social beings when things go really well. We are, in the very marrow of our bones, social being. Again, there is no individual human body that is not in a social body that enables it to be itself, to have an identity. We may be more than mammals, but as Sean mentioned earlier today, we are mammals, and as mammals, we are thoroughly related emotionally to not only other mammals, but to that other mammals in particular, but to everything with which we relate in a meaningful way. There is an emotional valence to our relationships. This is what distinguishes mammals from other forms of life, or one of the things is the emotional attachment initially to the offspring. You don't find mammals disconnected from social bodies. That's why mammals live in prides, herds, packs, dens, gaggles, murders, pods. And if we modulate that into the human universe, you have families, schools, teams, clubs, gangs, cliques. We are social creatures. And when we begin to feel that our body is in some way disconnected from the social body in which we have a meaningful place, in which we belong and matter, we begin to experience perhaps the most painful kind of pain the human being can experience at all, and that is emotional and social isolation. I was inspired to see that this organization is committed to not only the biological condition of dementia or Alzheimer's disease, but to the human experience. If you think about that clear rhetorical shift, what we are partly doing is relocating our imagination from dementia or Alzheimer's, from a thing that takes place in the brain, to some kind of thing that takes place in the body, both the individual body and the social body. What else could we mean by the human experience of dementia? To take this out of the world of abstractions and to give us all a kind of picture, I think, that will let us feel what I'm talking about, and that's as important as understand. I can tell you an experience that I had with my grandfather on my mother's side. At a certain point, he had been diagnosed with multi-infarct dementia and potentially Alzheimer's disease. When you get into this universe of the brain, the most complicated organism that we're aware of in the universe, to imagine that we're going to have some exact understanding of precisely what's going on, that too is something of a fantasy. But in any case, my grandfather had a neurodegenerative situation, and his capacities to follow the quote-unquote normal flow of things had been significantly compromised, and it reached a point in his relationship to his dementia that he could not necessarily leave and reliably return back to the house. And because my grandmother wasn't in the best physical shape, this put both of their, they were both in danger if my grandfather were to wander off and not come back. We did not have a support service like the kind of universe that you folks are building here. That didn't exist when this was going on in my world. But the family got together, and for will or woe, we came up with the idea that we would just reverse the locks and that everyone in the family would have a key and we would lock the lock from the outside. Now, if you ever visited my grandfather, at some point if you said to him, "Charlie, I'm going to need to go," his response to you was going to be, "Oh, boy or girl, what's your hurry?" Now, you could have been there 4 hours, 4 days, 4 months, and it would have still elicited the same, "What's your hurry?" But if you were able to prevail on my grandfather that you had to go home, that you actually had a life outside of his living room, then what he was going to do then was to help you collect your belongings. He was going to help you carry them and escort you to your automobile, put it in the trunk or the back seat as was your preference. He was going to wait for you to be ensconced in the driver's seat, and then he would say to you at some crucial moment that if you leave now, you'll arrive home at, and he would have figured out in advance how many miles away you lived, and he would tell you almost to the second when you should return home. He was a track coach, and that kind of orientation to time was his, we could say, comfort zone. Now, one particular day when I'm on the way out of my grandfather's house, it occurs to me at about 15 feet from the door that I was exiting that my grandfather was not going to be allowed, even the verb is painful to say, my grandfather wasn't going to be allowed to pass through that door with me. So I had to tactfully get from him the belongings that he was not going to carry to my car, and at the right moment, which I was guessing was the right moment, I increased the pace such that I could get outside the door and shut it and lock it before my grandfather was able to join me on the way to the automobile. It was a glass door with wood lattice running throughout it like veins, and it parceled off the door into rectangular sections. I recall even to this moment standing on one side of the glass pane, my grandfather on the other side of the glass pane, and I could hear the doorknob turning. And as it slowly was dawning on him that he wasn't going to be able to get out of the door, I could see that experience as it narrated himself and his facial expressions. And it said something to the effect of, "Boy, why can't I come with you?" Now, you have to know, as a grandchild who's been now in a scenario where I have in effect sentenced my grandfather to his own house, that kind of humiliation that I was feeling on both of our parts was introducing me to the dis-ease. In other words, there may or may not have been a disease involved here. Certainly everything that we do is mediated by neurons. That's just how our organism works. But for someone to witness this situation and conclude that this was a neurological phenomena would have been to miss the many, many existential layers that were at play, and would have missed entirely the nature and the cause of whatever we mean by suffering in the human experience of dementia. That is a particular stark example of how people who had previously been joined and were together in a single social body all of a sudden begin to have a kind of chasm or fissure or separation between them that we feel with our entire mammalian brain. That's the middle brain dedicated to the limbic system. All of a sudden, the limbic system, when it experiences itself disconnected from its social body, begins to indicate distress. Evolutionarily speaking, a mammal disconnected from its social body was not a mammal that was going to be long for this world. those kinds of anxieties are wired into our very being in the world. You can imagine this in other contexts, perhaps a little less dramatic. In my family, at Thanksgiving, grandmother makes the pecan pie. Now, I understand in this country it's pronounced pecan. Is that correct? Okay. Pecan is nicer according to Verde. I was in Florida and I'm inclined to ask about this pecan business. And so I asked some folks in Florida, is it a pecan or pecan state? And one elderly gentleman very kindly raised his hand, and I called upon him because it seemed like it was a crucial moment for him to contribute to the conversation. And he had me to know that pecan was something that you kept under the bed at night. So I have kind of tried, and now I've entirely ruined my analogy because I won't be able to say pecan without you having this kind of, and I'm sorry. So consequently, I'm just going to refer to it as a pecan and a pie, and then if you'll just bear with me, it will prevent anyone thinking of urination or anything along those. These are the things that my mother urges me not to talk about in public. It's just this, you're passing for normal, doing so well, and then, I'm like the whole kangaroo thing I would have gotten in trouble for. In any case, so grandmother makes a pecan pie. This is what grandmother does at Thanksgiving. But let's imagine now grandmother is experiencing cognitive incapacities that is making it difficult for her to do what they call sequencing, or to get the proportion of the ingredients in just the right way, and again with just the right time. And these are things that involve a great deal of abstractions. We're talking about models. This is what the cerebral cortex does. Our brain back here, we have three brains. The one that we call, that's on the brainstem, the cerebellum, that's referred to as the reptilian brain. It takes care of all the stuff that we don't want to think about but need to have done. So our respiratory system, digestive system, etc. The cerebral cortex here excels in abstractions. That's really what it does. It's able to imaginatively, if you will, separate itself from a present situation and context and do all sorts of things that are not necessarily related to what is happening in the present moment. And consequently, we can do a lot of things that other creatures can't do because we can make models and abstractions of those things, and then we can attempt to apply them to a present context. So that's what this brain excels in. And when this brain begins to experience impairment, there are lots of things you can't do if you can't navigate these kind of abstract universes. Any case, so let's imagine that grandmother's not going to contribute to the pie in such a way that it culminates in the culinary experience that earns grandmother universal applause. And let's say that her daughters, in a benevolent attempt to prevent her from feeling discouraged or that she has somehow failed, move in and say to her, again, with all totally loving intent, Mother, you have given so much of yourself, so much of your labor and love for all of these years. Why not now you just cool your jets, maybe take a holiday today and really enjoy your time with your family. Mother, why don't you take a place here on the couch and just sit back and relish your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. Now that, of course, could be done without the least ounce tincture of patronizing intent. And yet we can all see, nevertheless, that one of the things that makes grandmother in this particular family body during this particular time is the role that she plays in the making of the pecan pie. This, of course, does not exhaust grandmother's role or her purpose or value, and it's not to be understood as some kind of a task that grandmother is assigned in a sexist way. This is just the space in which grandmother has worked out her way of belonging and meaning in her family. Now, of course, grandmother is not just 10 or 20 feet away. She's worlds away now from the world in which she was grandmother. This is an example of how the isolation can begin. You can imagine all other kind of contexts. If you're professionally not able to perform the feats for which you're compensated, someone is going to more or less gently encourage you to take early retirement or spend some more time with your family. Over and above whatever you've lost in way of an income, your workspace, of course, is another social body. I want to really emphasize just how embodied we are. Without this devolving into a kind of morbid biology lesson, let's just consider that we all once upon a time were our mother's body. Okay, we became a body in that body, but once upon a time we were our mother's body. There is no me without you. And then when we left that body, we didn't just move into a disembodied space, we moved into the family body. Yet another body, just maybe more complex configuration with a greater degree of an emotional and social sort of currency being passed between the members of that body. So when that fateful day of kindergarten or first grade comes about, we leave the family body again. We don't move into some social free space. We move into the student body. From the student body, at some point, we're going to graduate. Again, we're not going to graduate out of an embodied existence. We're going to move into either another student body or to the corporation. Corporation from corpus, it's a word. It means body. To incorporate means to take into the body. Or we're going to go to the army, which is another kind of body. People say that an army moves on its stomach. That's a metaphorical way of imagining that the body involves a lot of members, but it's one whole unit, for instance. You could even go to prison. You wouldn't escape a social world. It would just be one that was organized with a little different expectations. But the point is that throughout our life, we move from social bodies to social bodies. And if we ever begin to experience ourselves as somehow not well situated, meaningfully situated within a body, that's when this limbic system is going to start to alert us that we are in a precarious situation indeed. Now, I stress all of this to underscore the fact that whatever we mean by caring, if it does not include creating spaces in which people with dementia still feel like that they belong and matter. If our caring doesn't involve keeping people with dementia connected to the social bodies in which they even have a me. Even the idea of person-centered care, we shouldn't lose track of how much a person is a social being. In one sense, a person doesn't even center on his or her own person. If they were, that would be a kind of emotionally arrested for a person to be preoccupied and centered on their own person. Persons often center and eventually always center on other beings. This is what enables us to be a person. So even when we say person-centered, we should imagine that that person is centered in a social body. And to lose its centering is to lose a dimension of its well-being. There is no well-being that is not well-being together. I mean, I don't want to go around legislating how people use phrases, but we should probably keep in mind well-being together. And thus our caring should be caring that keeps us together. And any caring that fails on that front, I want to proffer to you, is not caring enough. Real quickly, I think we would be wise to lean into that word caring. Like so many other phrases, if we don't think about it, we know exactly what it means, which is to say they are cliches that are circulating more or less mindlessly through our discourse. And we would probably be wise to not have that kind of passive relationship to the things that come out of our mouth. So let's consider for just a second what we mean by caring. In the English classes that I took, every verb could be classified into one or two categories, a doing verb or a being verb. Let's consider for just a second caring as a doing verb. How am I doing on time? I think I have until 11:50. Oh, good. Because I get so excited, sometimes I'll ask that and they'll say, you know, you've gone over 5 minutes, and they'll feel the same way to me. So keep an eye on me. Okay, so we're going to do caring as a doing verb. One way to begin to kind of get an architecture of caring, or let's say to disaggregate that cliche. One way I've gone about that is to include some prepositions. Prepositions don't get a lot of attention. I mean, the nouns and the verbs are sexy. Prepositions are kind of just doing yeoman labor, but prepositions really are absolutely vital for any kind of understanding because they signal relationships. Prepositions tell us how one thing is positioned with respect to another thing. Under, over, beside, etc. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to add 3 prepositions, and what I'm going to ask you to do is see if you can imagine, and the fancy word for this is phenomenology, but it just means sort of experientially make a distinction. Okay, we're going to make a distinction through experience. So doing to, doing for, and doing with. Now, so what I'm asking you is, can you imagine a difference experientially between doing to someone, doing for someone, and doing with someone? Okay, so just for fun here, there's no right or wrong answer. I don't have a script here. I take great delight in raising this kind of prompt and hearing what people share in response. So someone for fun, and if you can project your voice, if you're have the courage to contribute here, that would be much appreciated. And if folks can't hear you, I'll repeat what you say. And let's just briefly, and we can't go too far because we just have a little time factor here, but I'd like some folks to put on the table some of the distinctions in caring that I think will be absolutely vital to our having a kind of paradigm shift in what it means to care carefully. So somebody help us get started. A distinction in your imagination between doing to someone, doing for someone, and doing with someone. If you just raise your hand, don't be shy, really. Where's a hand? Yes, ma'am. Tell me your name. Alice, great. Alice, let her rip.
To my mind, doing to someone, the power is with the person who's doing. There seems to be an imbalance of power there, whereas doing with someone, there's more of a level, equal power or equal participation in the action.
Wonderful, Alice. So if we just, in Alice's typology, put 4 and 2 together in this sense that there's an inequity of power. It is asymmetrical with respect, let's say, to power, whereas doing with, according to Alice's way of categorizing this, something happens when we move from the 4 and the 2 to the with that changes the relationship with respect to power. It ceases to be an inequity and starts to become equal in some kind of sense. Is that fair, Alice? Okay, somebody else want to contribute? Yes, Ash.
Doing to is sort of depersonalizing.
Okay.
It's sort of objectifying. Doing for can be disabling, and then doing with can be enabling.
Okay, wonderful. So if we take Ash's typology, doing to is to structure the other subject as an object. Now really, we should lean into this for just a second, that any person's ability to be a person has a lot to do with how that person is positioned. And that we are a principal contributing factor to how someone else is positioned, and according to the way we position them, they either move closer to becoming an object and being an object, or conversely, they move in the direction of becoming or being a subject, and notice how that's not predicated on their neurons. This is a sociological phenomena, in other words. So thank you, Ash, for bringing that out and introducing that to our conversation. Now, with the doing for, you indicated that it was disabling. Is that how? Okay, so as Ash has imagined this, that someone could have a particular capacity to participate in the doing, but if we usurp the possibility of their contribution, we have, however well-intended, have incapacitated that particular person. And doing with, how did you characterize it? Is it enabling? So one of the things that we enable a person to do when we are with them in some kind of way is that we enable them to be a person. It's not only that we enable them to do something, we're enabling them to do something, therefore to be empowered, but over and above that, in a kind of more primordial vein, we're enabling that person to be a me, so to speak. It looks, Verde, something is on the tip of your lips.
Well, I just wonder about context, not so much in those 3 different ways, but the biblical adage of do unto others as you would have them do unto you seems like a very simple but very profound way to live your life, and that doesn't seem as though you're necessarily having a malevolent power over somebody else.
Okay, wonderful. This is a great way of imagining in any particular moment. If you're not sure what to do, Verde has suggested a kind of adage that you might just turn to, and if in all else fails, this particular saying may not. To do unto others as you would have others to do unto you is to call out a kind of profound insight that if you kind of want to understand how another human being is feeling, you have a sort of privileged access by virtue of being a human being, so don't lose track with that source of insight. So I appreciate you adding that. Okie dokie, now let me stress that this doing to and doing for are not the bad guys. This is not an either or here. This is important, of course, to recognize that care can assume and should assume manifold kind of expressions, and that doing to someone and doing for someone can be as much an act of love as doing with someone, depending again on the situation. This is to say that care cannot be reduced to a template. Okay, anyone who is doing tick marks in care has ceased to be in tune with the complexity of the situation, not only environmentally but interpersonally. So I just want to stress that yes, Christine. Christine wants to contribute something.
Can I just say that I'm not as these people on this subject, but if you do something to somebody or for somebody, you're using your brain. If you do it with them, then hopefully theirs is engaged.
Oh, wonderful. So Christine is underscoring again that by the doing that involves a with dimension, in the way we're relating to one another, you're inviting his or her brain, mind, being to help participate in the doing, including perhaps even the defining of what it is that we are doing. We should be mindful of that when we come together in any particular encounter, the first thing that has to be established conversationally between people is defining our situation. But look, as Christine has pointed out, if I don't invite your mind to participate in the defining, I have already, to a certain extent, turned you into an object. Now, again, there's no one who's trying necessarily to be imperious or to objectify people. This could be done completely with a benevolent intent, and yet nevertheless cut someone off from an ability to be a me. So perhaps we should just, we could talk about this and probably should in another context much longer, because this is the kind of nuance that distinguishes care that is genuinely careful and care that is cliche, constricted. I mean, really, it would be important in some context that you take out every cliche that comes up sort of habitually and repetitively in the discourse at your professional environment. You should probably put every cliche on the table and say, let's pretend we don't know what this means, and now let's talk. In the United States, if you eliminated the word appropriate, you would probably ruin most staff meetings, because folks, with respect to people, wouldn't know what to talk about at all, because appropriate and inappropriate has become the whole meaning of some kind of behavior management is another cliche. Yes, ma'am, and then we'll change gears. Tell me your name. Vicky.
Yeah. The doing to and the doing for, to me, doesn't require as much effort and time, whereas the doing with would require more time, because it's easier just to do something for someone rather than do it with them. And I'm thinking more of children as well as my elderly mother. It's so much easier just to do it and let it finish quick. But there's also interaction involved in the doing with and also in the doing for.
Wonderful. So Vicky has suggested that doing with requires a kind of interaction that involves effort. It involves time, but it certainly involves effort, and perhaps then the doing to and doing for, we might, as Ash was suggesting with respect to risk, we might at one level imagine that we are creating this scenario in the benefit of someone else's well-being, when in fact what we might be doing, as Vicky has pointed out, is making this more time efficient and less effortful for myself. Yes, ma'am.
It is also in our assessments, we're looking at how we can enable the person working with the person. So we're looking at what they can do, and that's amazing, I think. But on the other hand, from the service delivery point of view, there's things that we have to do to them and for them. For example, make sure that they are safe, make sure that they are looked after, because they can just enjoy their cup of tea with the support worker. But we eliminated all the risks, we eliminated all everything else. But I can see where it is the line to step over from that it is actually not good for the client. So I see doing with is the fun part for the client, is the service delivery that enables them to do more, to enjoy life, and anything else outside it is the to do for. Send a referral for them, make sure that they are safe, eliminating risk for them. That's what I can see. So it is just between making sure that it's a good balance between.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Tell me your name. Henrietta. Thank you, Henrietta. So the doing to and doing the for is, if you're going to move to the with, Henrietta has pointed out something that's vital here, that it would require you to begin to know the other person with a greater degree of intimacy, insight, and awareness. In other words, to move to the with means by necessity there will have to be a relationship. I will have to begin to attend to things about you that in the previous kind of framing did not require me to know about you at all, because you had been generalized. Now you're no longer generalized. You're a particular kind of person with particular ways of doing all sorts of things, including communicating. If you're in the 2 and 4 mode, I might not even be aware that you're communicating. I might imagine it's a behavior. Behaviors are generalized. Communication is always particular. If you're only managing behaviors, it might be because you've ceased to tune in to how someone is a particular person, and those behaviors should be better understood as communicative efforts. If you respond to a behavior as it's a behavior, that's going to create one kind of life world. If you respond to an act of communication communicatively, that's going to be an altogether different life world. And if you want to give someone behaviors in a really severe way, cease to communicate with them as if they're communicating with you, and they will behave. And what they'll be behaving to do is try to call attention to the fact that there's a primary need related to communication that you're not even tuned to, much less meeting. Sorry, I'll let go of that. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just it stood out for me. If someone is to do something to me or for me, I feel like an obligation. I feel like a task and a chore to them. But if somebody chooses to do something with me,
Yes.
it's instantly embraceable, and that resonates.
I think this is emotionally and psychologically profound. Tell me your name. Karina has suggested if I do something to someone and for someone, I am potentially positioning them to have an obligation debt. Now, not necessarily, okay? So you can't make you stark and fast generalizations here, but I am positioning that person in such a way that he or she might feel, understandably, that they are continually being the recipient of my exertions, and therefore I am in some ways exacting from them something that I would prefer that they not feel like they had to do to or for me. Whereas, wonderfully insightful, Karina has suggested that if I am with the person, including the defining what it is that we are doing with each other, then I am also potentially removing this whole exchange calculus. We're no longer keeping up with an obligation debt here. We've moved into a way of communicating and of being human where the world of scorekeeping is no longer meaningful. It has disappeared, and that's a wonderful way to move into meaningfulness. Okie dokie, I want to ask you another question, but I think we've all agreed that the doing 2 and 2 and 4, as vital as they might be, should never be dissevered from the with if we want there to even be a me in dementia. So I want to challenge us to consider yet another dimension of care. If we've imagined care now as a doing verb, we've agreed that doing with, there's something absolutely vital about that kind of care. Can you imagine a distinction between doing with, as in doing with someone, and being with, as in being with someone? This may be a bit more challenging emotionally and spiritually, but I think it gets a little bit more interesting as well. So if someone has an insight, don't worry about being right or wrong. We're thinking out loud here. Just raise your hand and we'll put something on the table here. The difference between doing with someone and being with someone. Yes, ma'am.
I think in our world of caring for somebody, we focus a lot on tasks rather than being with the person, and we only have a limited amount of time to do those tasks, and we concentrate on the fact that we're failing if we don't get those tasks done.
Wonderful. And that being with somehow is an exception to that. Tell me your name. Bianca suggested that the doing universe, even with the with potentially, is put the task at the center of attention, and that something happens when we move into the being with, that the task orientation subsides, diminishes, or perhaps entirely disappears, and something with respect to the relationship itself moves to the forefront of attention. In other words, that what we're doing now is actually being together, that our doing is a being. And over and above whatever we might accomplish with the task, we are more fundamentally accomplishing this thing called keeping people feeling that they belong and matter. Can you imagine if we accomplished all of our tasks in perfect timeliness and with perfect precision, and absolutely were oblivious to the four fundamental need of keeping people, human beings, feeling like they are being with us? If we did all of that other stuff and fail to be mindfully and intelligently creative in this space, what a colossal failure that would be with respect to our caring for anyone, people with dementia or otherwise. You know, virtually everything that you can say when you qualify it with a person with dementia, would be equally true if you got rid of the qualification. That's probably important for us to keep our mind and eye on, because one of the ways that we might frame situations that keep us and our risk safe is to frame an us and them boundary that somehow continually reassures us that we are aging normally. Yes, ma'am.
When you're being with someone, you're actually getting as much as you're receiving, as much as you're receiving. So it's that being with someone is actually a two-way street.
Now this is another profound insight. Tell me your name. Jenny has suggested when you're being with someone, it's not only that it's equal in some level, but your giving becomes a receiving. Your receiving is a giving. The distinction between receiving and giving begins to break down. In fact, when things really get intimately meaningful, every kind of binary begins to break down, including the binary of me and you or subject, object. All of those things begin to dissolve when we're being together. But is it Jenny? What Jenny has stressed here, often people will say, yes, but we don't have the time. You know, with the energy involved in what you're talking about, if what Jenny said was true, that if you're able in particular moments, and not all the time, but in particular moments throughout the day, to create a communicative relationship in which being and being together is animating that time and that space, that not only will you not be moving towards burnout, you will begin to be nourished. You will begin to be fulfilled. You know, there might be a lot of legitimate things about compassion fatigue, but I just want to call attention to the fact that it might not be the compassion that is the fatiguing part. There might be lots of things with compassion that we're doing that are fatiguing, so I'm not dismissing the reality there. But I have a hard time imagining that love is particularly fatiguing, because every time I've experienced it, the very world of work and effort sort of disappeared, even when it required a lot of labor. Yes, ma'am, and then we'll shift gears.
I don't think being with takes a lot of time.
Oh, this is wonderfully insightful. Keep talking.
Yeah, I think it could just be a moment, because I think it's a connection that is based around equality, and it's the me and me greeting me and you, and that can be just a moment, that acknowledgement.
Okay, another profound insight. It could be that when we are with each other, the very notion of time ceases to be meaningful. That maybe it's not a long time or a short time, because we're no longer in time anymore. We're in something else. I would say that something else is love. And that the idea that love is just not reducible to clock time anymore. So Sarah, thank you for pointing that out. And that's probably, that's going to eliminate a whole lot of resistance right there to being with, because the default reflex is we don't have time for that kind of stuff. Can you imagine if you went to a community that presented themselves as providing care, and they went through their panoply of offerings? They told you all about the interior design. They told you all about the activities. They told you all about the decor. They showed you the memory box. They did everything imaginable. And then they said, when they got to the one thought that at a certain point regarding nourishment, they said, now we have to be pretty candid. We don't do food here. I honestly see no distinction between making that admission and covering every potential facet of care and not being deeply invested in caring for a person's emotional and social needs. I would think you might as well have just said, we don't feed people here. It is the food that people are talking about when they say that man does not live by bread alone. Okie dokie, I want to show just a very brief excerpt from the documentary There Is a Bridge that I think will give us all a very concrete image of what being with looks like in quote-unquote real time.
When people are very old and deteriorated and no one enters their world and they're just sitting there, they will withdraw inward more and more. And their desperate need for connection is all now inside. And if a person is all alone, even if they're very, very deteriorated, there's a longing for this kind of closeness. Mrs. Wilson, hello. You want me to sit? Can you see me good? Gladys Wilson is a wonderful example of a person who is in the phase of repetitive motion, where people use movements, repetitive movements, because they don't have any more speech or very little speech, but they have human needs that need to be expressed. You're crying. You're crying. You have a tear right here in your face. You have a little pain. You don't want me to touch you. You're very sad. Can you see me? Is it scary? Are you afraid? And if this person sits with their eyes closed, rocking back and forth, and maybe there's a tear coming down, there's a need there. There's a little tear that's coming out. Do you feel it? You feel a little tear? If you gently use touch, and I touched Gladys Wilson for the fingertips right here on the cheek, is where the mother usually touches a child. If you touch an infant there, it looks up, and every cell remembers where it was touched by the mother. And often that person knows, even if they can't say a word at that moment, they won't talk, or they don't want to talk, but there's a communication. And that person is no longer alone. Can you let me in a little bit? You think? Just a little? You think I could be with you and Jesus for a minute? Jesus loves me, yes, I know, for the Bible tells me so. I used music, because when speech is gone, music, especially with Gladys Wilson, it was religious music, because there's emotion tied to it and safety tied to it. So I used her old church songs. Jesus loves me, yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me, the Bible tells me so. What I did was, when she moved, I moved with her. And when I was singing, because she didn't sing with me, so I matched the intensity of my voice to the intensity of her movement. And pretty soon, for a split second, we became one person. Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. So at one point, when she got very quiet and very peaceful, and my voice became very quiet as hers and very peaceful, and my breathing slowed to her breathing, she pulled me to her, and I moved with her. And for her, at that moment, I believe I was a symbol of her mom. Can you open your eyes now? Do you see me? Feel safe and warm? Yes? Can you sing with me? He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got the mothers and the fathers. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hands. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. The breakthrough doesn't happen every time. The person will not always open their eyes and look at you. But if you keep trying, And you keep centering yourself and really look at that person and really mirror their movements. Maybe not this time, but the next time you come, you'll have a communication. You feel safe. You feel safe? Yeah. With Jesus? Yeah. And me?
So I think this is a wonderful, wonderful illustration of how what might seem like from a third-person perspective to be behaviors and a simple neurological reflex, if entered into in a first and second-person perspective, that is to say from the inside out, starts to modulate from behaviors to very intense communication. And if someone will move into that communicative space and be with someone's movements. Now think about what we're suggesting here. If someone with dementia is moving into a kind of way of communicating to which we do not feel accustomed. You know, people say, you know, you need to sort of challenge your comfort zone. Speaking of risk, you could see here that this might be moving into places that are not only outside of our comfort zone, but start to quicken some of our deepest anxieties, period, about social rejection and not passing for normal. But look what happens if we restrict ourselves from the kind of risk of not being normal. Had Naomi Fowle, that's the Jewish lady you saw here, had she been risk averse with respect to passing for normal, Gladys Wilson would have remained a kind of living object in that community. There was a risk that she took, the risk not to be concerned what this may have looked like from an outside perspective. I mention that because in East Texas, it is not normal for white people and black people to put their faces together and to begin massaging each other's cheeks like mother. That's not normal in East Texas, and that tells me something that Naomi Fowle did not go and meet Gladys Wilson to pass for being normal. It also suggests to me that love is not normal because it is more than normal. I'm mentioning this because there reaches depths of awkwardness that without love, we're not going to be with any other person, including people with dementia. This is the big impediment. Ultimately, perhaps, is not time or resources, but the willingness to risk social awkwardness. The last thing I want to say, in case anyone's concerned that there's some kind of principally religious subtext here, Naomi Fowle is a secular Jew. You can rest assured she didn't grow up singing Jesus Loves Me. But again, Naomi Fowle didn't meet Gladys Wilson to validate Naomi Fowle. The wonderful thing about dementia is that it can lead us into places of our humanity where our workaday political us-them boundaries no longer hold value. In other words, people with dementia might be leading us into depths of humanity that we have forgotten. Okay, I want to close with a quick story that gives some indication. How am I doing? 20 minutes? That's a universe of time and talking time. Okay, I'll slow down a little bit then. Don't stop. Okay, I won't stop. Okie dokie. In 1987, I was a student at the University of Texas. I was a year away from graduating, and I started to have panic attacks because I had fantasized when I went off to college that I was going to graduate and then go back to my little hometown in East Texas, and I was going to be qualitatively different. I was going to be transformed, sort of like Pinocchio the puppet to Pinocchio the real boy, Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White, for any of you Lord of the Rings folks. I mean, there was something going to happen to me where I was no longer the Michael Verde that these folks used to know, and I would come back and there'd be this kind of aura, or I don't know what I thought, but it wasn't happening, and I was very aware of that. So I decided that I did not want to graduate until this thing happened, and I decided that this thing was, essentially, I needed to find myself. So I quit school at the University of Texas, and I moved to Paris, France, with the intention of finding myself. I wasn't going to come back till I found myself. I have no idea in retrospect what made me think that myself was in Paris, France. But it wasn't a bad choice, I think you'll have to admit. So I went about this in a lot of different ways. I started reading. I was already reading, but I just doubled up on my reading efforts because I didn't have to be bothered with all the school stuff that was actually getting in the way of my reading. So I just sort of hunkered down and would read, protracted periods of time. I also started visiting art galleries, art museums, hanging out in coffee shops, and trying to kind of assume an entire sort of angst look and expression, imagining I was sort of Sartre-like and getting deeper and deeper in some kind of philosophical vein. All these things that, and none of them particularly helped me find myself. But then somewhere along in my reading, I came across some things in Buddhism and part of one of the traditions of Zen. There are these things called koans, K-O-A-N. And a koan is something that when the disciple, the student, initiate goes to the master, the guru, and asks for enlightenment, they're not given the answer to the test, as might be the case in the West. Instead, the initiate is given a koan. The most famous koan, at least in America, made famous by J.D. Salinger, the epigraph of one of his novels, is "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Now, the idea, of course, is that this kind of query does not lend itself to rational or analytical comprehension. The very idea of comprehend means to entirely engulf or to get completely around, and a koan prevents what we typically associate with the analytical or left hemisphere. It prevents that analytical side of our brain from getting around whatever it is that has been asked. In other words, it gives it something that is not a problem to solve. And that part of our psyche will in time grow frustrated and will eventually give up, and that's precisely what's supposed to happen, because when that part of our psyche lets go of the reins, there's other dimensions of our being that start to get a word in edgewise. And in Eastern traditions, this other part is where enlightenment occurs or does not occur. So I decided that I absolutely had to have a koan, that this is how I was going to find myself. It was kind of a drastic intervention. I gave myself randomly a koan. And the koan that I gave myself said, "Show me the face you wore before your mother and father were born." I almost gave it back because that's impossible. But then it occurred to me that that was really part of the whole deal, that you couldn't just kind of keep tinkering around until you got an easy koan, you know. An easy koan in East Texas, the answer would be Jesus, and then that would be the end. So I couldn't get it, you know, that wasn't the answer. So really, once a day for 45 or 60 minutes, I would roll down the metal curtains of my little studio apartment, which is about 15 minutes from the Eiffel Tower, and whatever sunlight was available would skirt under that curtain and just sort of bathe the ratty carpet where I lived. And I did not know how to meditate. Again, it's from East Texas. I knew that it involved not talking and that your legs should be uncomfortable. So what I would do for about an hour every day is make sure my legs were uncomfortable, and I would just be quiet. And then I would reflect on my koan. And then this didn't do anything except after a while, my legs got comfortable being uncomfortable. So that was a kind of, I guess, a kinesthetic achievement. But on the 10th day of the 11th month, all of a sudden, my mind's ear, my mind's eye had absolute clarity as what the meaning of my koan was for me. And the meaning was your grandparents. My grandparents wore the face that I wore before my mother and father were born. And with that insight, I knew that my action step was simple. I needed to get back home to East Texas where my grandparents lived, and I needed to take an interest in their life and their life stories, because there was a far greater chance that the self that I was looking for was in their life stories than it was in Paris, France. 10 days later, my mother and stepfather picked me up from Bush International Airport. On our way back home, we stopped at Walmart, and I bought every 90-minute cassette that Walmart sold, and then I went to live with both sets of my grandparents. My mother's grandfather, who I've previously mentioned, really found great delight in my interest in his storytelling, and the more stories he shared, the more he remembered, and we spent hours, he in his orange recliner, me in the couch catty corner to his recliner. Between us was my little brother's jam box where the cassettes were whirring, and then a red Folgers coffee can filled with a paper towel. This was my grandfather's spittoon. I understand that spittoon is not a universally recognized term. I learned that last night. We don't have urns. You guys don't have spittoons. We really ought to get together and hours and hours. I took these stories and then I extracted from them a kind of narrative trajectory and put these stories and made a kind of novella, in other words, out of these hours of cassettes. I went and published the novella at Kinko's, self-published. I put it in with a kind of fake leather green. It was what I could afford. And I brought this book to my grandfather titled Over and Under and Back from Whence You Came. That was a phrase that he taught me when I got back from Paris and moved in with him and grandmother. He discovered one day somehow that I didn't know how to tie a tie. That was unbelievable to him, that someone in their 20s, ostensibly going to get a degree and have a family, did not know how to tie a tie. So we marched into the bathroom, and he explained, using over and under and back from whence you came, how you could tie a tie. Now, I'm not wearing a tie now, not because I don't know how to tie one. Please no. In any case, this was the title. And my grandfather loved reading his story about his lives. I had no way of knowing at the time. The family had no way of knowing at the time. But 5 years later, my grandfather began to evince conspicuous symptoms of memory loss. First thing he began to forget were certain common nouns. I remember the day he forgot the word hockey. Wasn't a big deal. You can live an entirely fruitful life in East Texas and never once say the word hockey. Then the next thing he began to forget, and this was consequential, were the names of close friends. Personal nouns now. And when my grandfather was sharing a story about something and someone who had been good to him in a particularly crucial way, and he would reach a point where he was going to share that person's name, if it eluded his grasp, I could see on his face the dis-ease of his dementia. He wasn't experiencing that as a lapse in memory. He was experiencing it as a betrayal of friendship. This is the difference between the way something is experienced from the inside out versus the way we make sense of it from the outside in. We should probably get habituated to letting go of a third-person perspective and being able to, at least in certain crucial moments, assume a first- and second-person perspective. There came a point when, as I mentioned, my grandfather could not freely leave the house because he might not return. There came a point when my grandfather was no longer able to read his story. He would sometimes then ask my grandmother or a visiting friend to read to him his story. Very interesting moment. These were his stories. He knew that, but he didn't know how they were going to end because the details now were not something that he could readily recall. So he would listen to his story almost as if he was living it in a kind of first time, which is a remarkable existential thing to see. I remember watching this on one occasion and saying to myself, where is my grandfather's self now? Is it in his brain? Is it in his stories? Or is it in the voice of the person reading the stories that is going back into his brain? There is no me in dementia without you. There came a day when my grandfather was not able to bathe himself or toilet himself or to feed himself without assistance. And then there came a day when my grandfather was no longer with us, or so it appeared to me. Family members from all across Texas, we returned to my grandfather's home before his funeral. At some point, when folks were scattered about the house, my mother came to me and she said, son, why don't you get one of those tapes that you made of your grandfather telling stories and play it? That might be a source of solace to people. And so I did. I found where grandmother had kept the cassettes. I found another way to amplify it, put that stereo player in the middle of the living room, and found the story that I knew meant the most to my grandfather personally. It's the only one where a tear ever came to his eye. And I hit play and turned the volume up. And very interesting to me, I first noticed that the conversations began to subside in volume and then entirely stop, and people began in pairs or individually or in some larger configuration finding their way, as if by some kind of interesting instinct, just finding their way into the living room and circling around my grandfather's voice. I had an image of people around the fire at any once a time, or just people were coming together to be remembered around the voice that constituted the center of their being a social body. And I also watched this and had the incredible thought of, where is my grandfather's self now? It occurred to me that my grandfather had pulled a trick on Alzheimer's disease, so to speak, because when Alzheimer's disease came to take his self, he had already given his self away. He had just taken his labor, his love, his attention in us, and he had just loved himself into ourselves. He had just put himself in a body that Alzheimer's disease will never reach. There is no me in dementia without you. I want to close by sharing with you the story that my grandfather shared that I hit play and that constituted the most meaningful story that my grandfather shared with me. He was 10 years old, sitting with his sister Benny on a bale of hay at his grandfather's house. He was demonstrating to Benny how he could strike a match with one hand. He was having a little difficulty with that, so they went into the house. Little did he know he was a little better at it than he thought. One of those matches actually went over his shoulder, struck, landed in the hay. That hay worked like kindling wood. Caught that barn on fire. Inside the barn was that year's entire cotton crop. In addition to that cotton crop was the following year's seed crop. Burned it all down. My grandfather said to me, "Don't you know, boy, that was the worst day of my life. I was wiped out." This was his expression. I was wiped out. My granddaddy had taken me in to raise, which he had done when my grandfather was 6, when his parents divorced. He chose to live with his grandparents. They took him in the home, and here he was, he said, and because of one act of carelessness, he had wiped out his old granddaddy. He was sitting on the stump waiting for his granddaddy, whose name incidentally was T.E. Rowe, to come home. T.E. was the judge of Hartshorn, Oklahoma. When T.E. arrived, he crossed the yard. I could imagine that this was Judgment Day for my grandfather. He told me that 3 times he tried to explain to his granddaddy what had happened, and every time he broke down into sobs. And on the 3rd unsuccessful attempt, he said, my granddaddy scooted on that stump with me, extended his arm around my shoulder, pulled me gently to his side, and he said to me, "Boy, your old granddaddy has made a mistake or two in his life. The sun will come up tomorrow." When my granddaddy told me that, he looked at me from his orange recliner and he said, "Son, I'm 77 years old, and I pray and hope before I die I'll learn how to love like my old granddaddy loved me." And when he said that to me, I saw the face that I wore before my mother and father were born. And I have a feeling that that was the face that my granddaddy saw on the face of his granddaddy when he told him, "Boy, your old granddaddy has made a mistake or two in his life." I've often wondered where that old man, and by old man I mean my granddaddy's grandfather, came by the love, came by the wisdom, and that crucial moment with a dismembered boy, a child who was wiped out, where he came by the compassion in that moment to understand that over and above raising cotton, he was raising a child, and that the two compared, there was no comparison. He was more into raising that child than he was into raising cotton. And where there had been a barn that was now burnt to the ground, that old man, with his extension of self, with his willingness to be with my grandfather, he built a bridge. He built a bridge out of his love, affection, the tone of his voice, the arm on my grandfather's shoulder, and he healed a little boy who would have never gotten over that. He remembered him. I'm sharing this story with you, with all of us, because there are thousands of people in your community who feel that they have, for one reason or another, ceased to be qualified to meaningfully belong in the social bodies where they previously felt that they belong. And I want to challenge all of us to keep in mind that for us to feel that we want to be alive includes feeling like we are with other people. And this doesn't require talking in the, quote, normal way. This requires 2 people being in emotional resonance and recognizing the equity between them and that they are dialogically related, each as valuable as the other, sharing their love and affection with one another in whatever communicative mode is available. If we'll do this, neurons will not magically be rewired, but the emotional and social isolation that is ultimately the source of the human experience that we consider suffering with dementia will be healed. Thank you very much, and God bless you and your work.